Good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you're joining us from. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar brought to you by Illumio. Entitled How to Secure Your Crown Jewel Applications with Micro-Segmentation, you're going to get a lot of knowledge today dropped on you about what micro-segmentation is and how it can help you make sure your organization stays secure. Today, our presenter is Katie Wood, Senior Product Marketing Manager with Illumio. Katie, thank you for joining us for today's event.
Thank you.
My name is Scott Lowe. I'll be moderating today's event. We'll be doing some Q&A at the end. And I want to make sure you ask your questions. So in the GoToWebinar control panel, you're going to notice that there's a Q&A or a questions pane. If you have any questions at all about today's content, we highly encourage you to ask questions. This is a live event. We will be taking your questions live at the end of today's event. No question is too small. No question is too big. We actually really like questions being asked during our events. You'll also notice in the handouts pane in the GoToWebinar control panel that there is a paper for you to download from Illumio. It's a white paper that helps you understand this topic in more depth. And we'll be asking a poll question at the end of today's event as well that's important for us to understand. So we'll be putting that up after we're through with the main presentation. At the very end of the event, we'll be giving away a $300 Tango gift card, and one lucky winner will walk away with that. So without further ado, I'm going to have Katie take over from here and talk to you about what Illumio does and what they bring to the table. Katie, take it away.
Thanks so much, Scott. Thanks for having me, and thanks everybody for joining me today. We're going to be talking about securing your high-value assets, what we sometimes call crown jewel applications. For our agenda, we're going to start with some of the people and process aspects of it. How do you build consensus in your organization and successfully get an initiative through? And after that, we'll drill down more into the technical side of physically segmenting and ring fencing your high value assets with micro-segmentation. What is it? Why do we do it? What are the principles of it? And how to successfully deploy with the strategy in 5 steps. So how do we identify our crown jewels? If you have a compliance obligation, and I saw in one of the early polls that when we asked about challenges folks are facing today from attendees on the call, compliance is the #1. So many of you probably have a very good idea of what your crown jewel assets are, particularly if you have a SWIFT or a PCI mandate from regulators. If you do not, let's say you're looking for a defensible framework to figure them out, a good place to start is Nist. So the Nist cybersecurity framework is a voluntary set of standards, guidelines, and best practices for cybersecurity. Originally, it was aimed at critical infrastructure, like maintaining the power grid and making sure it doesn't go down. But it's now leveraged by a variety of businesses to secure mission-critical systems, whatever that means to them. It's a high-level approach to securing crown jewel assets, and the first step is identify the risks and then sort of define them by their business impacts and likelihood. The specifics of this obviously depend on your business. As a framework, the benefits are that it gives you a starting point to make decisions with your other stakeholders, which we'll get to next, and then it also gives you a unified approach that you can defend to third parties if the need ever arises. So unless your IT operates in a total vacuum, crown jewel initiatives like data privacy initiatives or regulatory initiatives are typically cross-functional. Some of you may operate lean and kind of have a kayak that you can direct anywhere you want to organizationally. Others of us are employed on sort of an aircraft carrier, and turning it around takes a lot of committees and consensus. So you're probably going to need buy-in across departments in order to execute this effectively. There's likely going to be critical input from all these stakeholders required, especially if you're using Nist and gauging what's important to the business. What is the risk to the business of failure, like we saw with the Nist framework? So we see our folks gathered around the table, and what they're going to tell you are what are the regulatory ramifications of a data breach? What is the impact to the business if your systems fail, if your reputation is damaged, if you lose your competitive edge? What are the legal ramifications? What are the hard dollar costs and what are the soft dollar costs? I'll just say kind of on a basic project management note here, it's important to have the right stakeholders from the outset, because if you exclude people or add them in downstream, it can add cycles to your project inevitably. Potentially, it greatly expands the scope if there's a requirement that somebody brings in later, or it can even derail it entirely. So the point of this slide is just make sure you've got the right people at the table before you begin the conversation. What are our high value assets? Again, systems governed by regulatory requirements are pretty easy targets for crown jewel application initiatives. PCI and SWIFT, for examples, for governing credit card transactions or banking transfers, you have a mandate for these to protect these systems. Same with personally identifiable information, or PII. However, there are a lot of systems that are critical to your business: IP, client and employee data, billing, or other financial information. And as we kind of discussed on the last slide, involving other business stakeholders will really bring this into perspective. It's critical to identifying the importance and the risk to the business. Nist is your framework there. Also, keep in mind, value can either be in data that has a positive impact that you don't want to potentially lose because of its importance. It can also have value in a negative way as toxic assets that shouldn't be exposed, such as client data. Here you want to think about the Panama Papers. There are a lot of kind of doomsday scenarios you can think about here, and as security professionals, it's our job to stay paranoid, so make sure you consider everything. How do we calculate the value of our assets? I've been thinking about this a lot lately. How do you value them? How do you put a price on what's priceless? If any of you saw what's been happening at Notre Dame over in Paris, kind of watching the towers burn and wondering how much of it was going to be left, it makes you think about how do you recover from something that's sort of irrecoverable. Luckily, it looks like that's going to have a little bit more of a happy ending. But in our case, this is really where you want to make a business case for controls. In this scenario outlined on the slide, we've taken the cost of customer acquisition, the cost of breach remediation, the cost of breach communications, and multiplied it times total customer numbers. If you don't have any idea what these numbers might be for your business, a great place to start is the Ponemon Institute report on the cost of a data breach. It really goes into the cost of breach remediation and the cost of breach response in terms of building customer databases, getting bounce back emails, working with regulators and remediation teams. They have hard dollar costs assigned to all of those. It can be a really great reference. So you're going to come up with some large round numbers at the end of this exercise, as you see at the bottom. If these seem inflated to you or your stakeholders, I would point you to some actual breach costs. If you look at Ponemon, I think the global average for a breach is around 3.8 million. In America, it's twice that, it's almost 8 million. And if you look at actual breach costs, such as those from Target or Yahoo, British Airways, or Equifax, several of those are more than the estimate at the bottom of the slide. So consider all scenarios. In terms of choosing a control, the recommendation from Nist for access control is to limit access to only authorized users. In technical terms, this means you need to not give open access unless it is specifically granted for a particular user or process or device. You're enforcing what we call a default deny posture that requires whitelisting or specifying exactly who should have access from the outset. You may have heard of Zero Trust as a security framework that's gaining traction. Zero Trust is really all in the name. It means that the posture is default deny, whether it's an internal or an external user or process. It also requires that you break down your defense into granular areas of enforcement for ring fencing, typically through an approach we call micro-segmentation, which we'll be drilling down into later in the presentation. The important thing to understand from this slide is that you must be able to isolate your crown jewel assets from the rest of your systems and then enforce default deny access permissions to ensure there's nothing that's authorized except what you intentionally permit with forethought. So how do you choose a micro-segmentation solution? Again, it's important to have all your stakeholders at the table. In this case, it's going to be cross-functional amongst your IT teams because ring fencing crown jewel assets requires collaboration of folks who are in security engineering, security ops, networking, the application team itself, and potentially server platforms. I took a little screen grab on this slide from the white paper that you can download that's referenced for this webinar. And I won't just read off the slide, but we'll double click a little bit later on some of the different types of solutions that are available in the presentation. I would just emphasize at this point that it's important to include and consider vendors from each kind of solution type. Again, we'll kind of go over what's available later, but the upshot is that each of these has its trade-offs, and each different solution type might have its own champions internally from your team. So if you're not able to review all of the options collectively, it can be difficult to move forward and agree on something, or conversely, it can be difficult to disqualify them collectively because someone still might have their favorite that you haven't considered. So with that, what is micro-segmentation we've been talking about? We talked about zero trust and the need to ring fence your assets and then apply default deny permissions, but let's take a look at how that works to prevent the spread of breaches. So if you think of your network as one of these submarines, the one on the left has a really strong perimeter, but no segmentation inside to separate the different parts of the craft in case it gets breached. If it's damaged by a torpedo, the whole thing's going to go down. If it's carrying ammunition and that explodes internally, the entire craft could sink. By comparison, the one on the right can potentially take on damage in any one portion of the craft without compromising the rest of it. Its attack surface for any given breach is greatly reduced. If it is breached, whether internally or externally, only one compartment is going to be damaged, and there's a greater likelihood that it will survive intact as a whole. Another way to think about it for those of you who travel a lot is like with a hotel. If you go into hotels today, there might be a card key entry at the front door. There's one on every floor for you to get into the floor you're staying on. There's one for your room. There's one for the club. There's one for the pool. Imagine if a hotel only had the card key entry at the entrance on the perimeter, and then once you were inside, you could access any kind of room, any safe, any sort of valuables in there. And that's the risk that you're taking without microsegmentation. There's nothing to limit the spread of breaches through lateral movement. So back to this definition in an enterprise environment, microsegmentation is a method of isolating and segmenting processes, workloads, applications, or entire environments in order to, number one, control any communications in and out of the segment, and number two, contain the attack surface and area of compromise in case of breach. So in our example, the blast radius in the submarine. In our case, access works through something called whitelisting, which we talked about previously, a policy that only gives access to approved entities and denies anyone not approved. We talked about this in the context of Nist and with zero trust frameworks. Basically, you don't want to give access to anyone unless it's permitted. So why does microsegmentation matter? Why is this important? Well, here we see a representation of a breach in recent memory, the Target breach. And what happened with that is that hackers went in through an HVAC vendor's portal to Target with legitimate credentials. And because of vulnerabilities in the application, they were able to move laterally through the network until they reached the point of sale system, which you see a little further on the right. Once they did that, personal information for 70 million customers was compromised. And this is a pattern we see over and over again. Another example is the Bangladeshi bank heist, which led to tighter regulation around ring fencing SWIFT applications, if some of you are looking at that regulation. It turns out that the common denominator of most major breaches is lateral movement, or what we call east-west traffic, as opposed to the north-south traffic in and out of your perimeter. This means threat actors accessing a seemingly low-value system like the HVAC portal and then spreading laterally through a network that they now have free access to until they finally reach the high-value assets of interest like the point-of-sale system. And from there, they can cause varying levels of damage, loss, theft, exfiltration of IP. So you see on this slide, the 2018 total breach numbers are not in yet that I've found, but you can see that breaches are common, and the average dwell time for an infiltrator on your network was 78 days in 2018. Imagine what someone can find with 78 days of surveillance. That's nearly an entire business quarter of being in your network and developing a 30-60-90 plan for targeting your key assets. We see this pattern over and over again. And so the question is, once a threat actor has gained access to your network via some low-value asset, what is stopping that lateral movement? What do you have in place to disrupt it? And that's really where microsegmentation comes in. These are some of the primary use cases for microsegmentation. Some enterprises just want visibility into mapping their application dependencies to understand the communications and flows between them. Others are meeting compliance requirements, like a number of folks on this call. Businesses with high-value assets may just want to ring-fence those proactively in a crown jewel initiative, regardless of a compliance obligation, just for risk mitigation. And finally, cloud migration is another huge driver for reasons we're going to discuss in a second. Let's talk about compliance. In the last few years, we've seen a marked uptick in interest, and here are some of the reasons. We mentioned just general risk management, seeing microsegmentation as a foundational capability that's really table stakes for risk reduction. But for regulatory mandates like SWIFT and PCI, these explicitly call out segmenting your environment or portions of it. Sometimes these that you see on the slide here are global in nature. Sometimes they're regional or country specific. California now has a cybersecurity mandate. Typically, they're industry specific and often centered around an application or a set of applications. So compliance is a big driver for this, and for many of you on the call. Again, the end goal is the same, risk mitigation, but rather than leaving it to chance, supervisory bodies are mandating these controls to kind of share the pain and the joint responsibility. And it can trickle down to GDPR, to third parties as well, as we've seen with GDPR in the last few years. So you want to have your bases covered. That's great. So what's the issue? What is the challenge here? Well, solving for that lateral movement problem is easier said than done. The number of vectors and routes and pathways to get to a target system is huge, and it's been growing exponentially. The fact is that with the growth of cloud, particularly, our IT environments have become massively overconnected, as you see on this slide here. What we're looking at is a view into a typical enterprise with about 100 workloads. The red and the green lines here represent interactions or flows of communication between the workloads. Sometimes that means intra-app communications between tiers or microservices. Sometimes that means inter-application communications, upstream and downstream apps. So we estimate for these roughly 100 workloads, that's about 200,000 flows that we see on the picture here. The reason we have this problem is that environments look like this, massively connected, in fact, overconnected. And if we think about the last decade, with all of the innovations we've had in enterprise IT, data center consolidation, the move to the cloud, the rise of dynamic environments like virtualization containers, all of these things actually make these challenges more challenging. For one thing, our environments are more complex than ever before. It makes it easier for intruders to hide. And number two, they're more interconnected than ever before, meaning they have plenty of systems and data to access while they're inside. Our environments are also increasingly complex. Why is that? Where are all those red and green strings coming from? Well, some of the workloads we saw in the red and green yarn ball, they may be static in nature. They might be on bare metal or on long-lived server instances. But you can imagine that as monolithic apps have kind of disintegrated into microservices, as we have more ease to spin up and spin down workloads in public clouds, and essentially ephemeral workloads, the picture is getting a lot more dynamic, as we see in the first figure here. So it's dynamic. Workloads are distributed globally across data centers, heterogeneous environments, bare metal, virtualized, and containerized. And you see here at the end, throw in hybrid and multi-cloud for good measure. There's a massive race to the cloud that's been going on for the last 2 years. And part of that is having a multi-cloud strategy for a lot of different enterprise clients who don't want to have vendor lock-in with any particular vendor. However, that brings with it the security challenge of needing separate security systems. It's really better to centralize so that you're not dealing with multiple different solutions. How does it work? So segmentation's been around for as long as we've been connecting networks together. It started out with routers that we placed at the edge called perimeter firewalls. These segmented the inside from the outside. Then it progressed to creating a DMZ using a firewall sandwich. So you had trusted, semi-trusted, and untrusted environments. From there, it went further within the network, leveraging capabilities of networking infrastructure like switches and routers to use VLANs and access control lists, ACLs, so that we can help define segments on the network. Now we see the firewall moving deeper into the data center. But customers also see a lot of challenges with these traditional approaches, especially as you want to define more granular policies. And that's what we have laid out on this slide. There are often no methods of visibility into the traffic flows. It's time consuming and it starts to get unmanageable. If you remember that spaghetti mess diagram we were looking at, how do you define policy for 100 workloads, let alone thousands? Firewall rules start to get unwieldy. Put aside the fact that more network devices come with physical limitations on the amount of memory they have, and that memory is where the policy and rules are kept. So there's another possible limitation. Operating these traditionally creates a lot of trial and error. There can be heavily manual parts of the process, and that can result in outages and downtime, which is never acceptable. It also forces all the apps to go through choke points. You need to reroute your traffic accordingly. Because IT is increasingly dynamic, it's difficult to keep up with application changes with static policies. And finally, your physical data center firewalls cannot move with you to the cloud, which leads a lot of organizations to reevaluate their segmentation options. So upshot, a big part of the problem is we're using the wrong tools. Organizations try to take the firewalls from the edge and move them into the data center and enforce subnets and zones and restrict traffic that way. But there's some big caveats here. Number one, choke points. You have to re-architect your entire network. It's static, it's not dynamic, it's expensive, it won't work in the cloud. More firewalls means more to manage, which means more mistakes. The upshot is the network is not the place to enforce security policy. It's just a bad scenario and it doesn't scale. So with that introduction, what are the tools available for microsegmentation? Clearly, I'm not unbiased here. I do sell software for a living. But here's a roughly agnostic view of the landscape of microsegmentation. And you'll need to consider all of these probably before you find out which one works best for you. I recommend bringing in vendors from each type just so you're able, when you have your stakeholders from IT, to agree on them or disqualify them collectively. So traditional firewalls can be used to segment on the network. The trade-off here being segmentation is going to be tied to the network. You may not have the visibility or the control outside of it. Also, it's heavily manual, it's complex, it's time-consuming and error-prone to rewrite the firewalls when circumstances dictate. Secondly, there are vendors that segment on the hypervisor, the trade-off being that a hypervisor vendor will likely prefer its own technology. And again, you may have limitations associated with segmenting through your infrastructure. Finally, you can segment at the workload level, leveraging the native firewalls in the OS, which means that the workload is protected regardless of where it sits, and that includes the cloud. So, what are the principles of microsegmentation? How can we be sure to meet our requirements and have a successful deployment and become security superheroes within our organization? To achieve the goals of microsegmentation, here are some considerations when choosing a technology. These are the essential ingredients for a successful project. If you're going to understand and control this mess, the red and green yarn ball we see over here representing the modern data center in the cloud, you need a different approach that addresses 5 things. 1, support for all environments and platforms, centralized preferably. 2, application-centric visibility, being able to have that visibility so you can protect, because you can't protect what you can't see. 3, centralized policy creation and management, regardless of how many clouds or environments you have. 4, adaptive and automated, especially in the cloud. And I saw in our poll that a lot of folks on the call today are working with the DevOps motion. Manual efforts in that realm are really going to fail. So you need a high level of automation. And finally, customizable granularity that you can make more specific to your environment. The objective of all of these is that given how heterogeneous our environments are now, hybrid, multi-cloud, virtualized, bare metal, the goal is really to support all the environments that you're in, as well as those you're going to be in going forward. So it's really critical to future-proof whatever you're going to be doing in the future. And just bear in mind, we're here to protect the applications, not the network. For context, I wanted to have some real-world examples because it's also useful to think about what you want to do with microsegmentation from the outset. We're talking about crown jewel applications today, so that's going to be number 2, application segmentation, segmenting your application, obviously. But there's also environmental segmentation, separating development and production environments. And this can have a regulatory angle to it as well. If there's a feeling that you're a massive linchpin for the global economy and you have development that's interfering with your production environment, regulators may come to you and say, we need some proof that you're segmenting your environments there. Third on the list there, we see tier segmentation, separating the web from the database from the application servers to reduce the ability of attackers to move freely through an application. And then finally, there's process segmentation, for example, protecting Active Directory. If you'd like to control communications down to the process level and automatically adjust policy there. We sometimes call this nano segmentation. So now we've covered the technology. Let's take a look at the process involved. What is success going to look like for us? Once you've decided on a tool, step 1, the step after that is to identify the low-hanging fruit that will give you the biggest return for your efforts. Which systems do you want to go after first for segmentation? The trick here is you do not want to boil the ocean all at once. Once you've got a plan, after that, you need to map your application dependencies, unravel the big red and green ball of yarn. And you need visibility for this because you can't protect what you can't see. Next, you want to build, test, and enforce your policy, then decide iteratively what you want to tackle next. You can start out with very coarse-grained policy if that's what's the easiest to implement, and then become more granular as you go. You can also spread through the environment at your own pace and decide what you want to do next. Let's drill down a little bit into these steps. So we covered some of the different vendor options. It's important to think about your own environmental requirements today and how they'll change. We talked about the importance of visibility because you can't protect what you can't see. You also want to think about how you'll manage and enforce policy, and you want to be able to model policy before you enforce it to make sure there are no application dependencies that are going to break once they're applied and give you some really unacceptable downtime. This can be a very painful lesson learned, so very important. Next, you want to decide what to segment first. You don't want to segment everything at once. It's like that old joke about how you eat an elephant. You eat an elephant one bite at a time. If you're under a compliance mandate, again, you might have a good idea of what you need to segment, like your PCI or Swift segment systems. Otherwise, it's worthwhile to think about what your most high-value assets are with Nist or some other framework, and then what's their connectivity to your other applications? What's their exposure? What might your adversaries' motivations be in accessing them? Again, because this is a cross-functional process, you also want to think about the people factor. Who are the application owners that are going to be involved that you'll be collaborating with? And just once again, Nist is a good framework for determining your collective priorities if there aren't any low-hanging fruit that are immediately apparent. So next you want to start to map your environment so you can start deriving order from chaos. This is what the big ball of red and green yarn looks like once you've unraveled it. You can see all the discrete applications and how they're working with each other. I want to be able to see what policies I might put in place based on historical flows that I've observed. How will that policy affect the pathways and vectors? Is it doing what I expected? This all feeds into the next phase. So next you want to model what-if scenarios to test those policies before jumping right to enforcement. This is the best way to make sure you will run a successful segmentation initiative and you don't break anything. Very important, no downtime. Test policy before you can enforce it. So lastly, the purpose of this fifth step is really to reinforce that you want to take an iterative approach and not boil the ocean. Treat this like a risk management exercise, and as with most things in life, the 80-20 rule, as well as the law of diminishing returns, applies here. Your efforts should really match the results you're planning to get. Also note that for some companies, probably not those enforcing security around crown jewel applications, but some companies just want the visibility and may not enforce everything all at once. They may not enforce ever at all. It just depends on your goals and objectives as an organization. So to sum up, here's some closing advice for success. Our best practices to have a successful microsegmentation deployment: start with visibility, can't protect what you can't see. Test policy before enforcing to ensure there's no downtime. Segment in phases and then expand through your environment at your own pace. Build partnerships cross-functionally between security, infrastructure, and application teams to make sure you're able to kind of execute as one. And lastly, it helps if you have an internal champion who can help drive the project. If it's around compliance, that might be an easier ask. If not, it's good to find someone else in the business who shares your priorities around it. So whether it's visibility to understand what to microsegment, or you already know and you want to test policies, or you have policies in place and you want to identify violations, microsegmentation is a critical piece of your security posture for preventing the spread and the impact of breaches. That's it for today. Thanks so very much for your time. I hope it's been helpful.
Katie, we have some questions from the audience. While we're doing Q&A, I'm going to put up a poll question for the audience to answer. We want to understand what your plans are around microsegmentation in your data center, or or for the cloud for the coming year. So let's start with some questions we've got, Katie, if you're ready.
Yeah, absolutely.
So the first one is basically, should I, when I adopt a microsegmentation solution, should I just microsegment everything to get the immediate benefit of high level of security?
I would say not initially. Eventually, it's not impossible, and some companies with a very secure risk profile do that. It's very viable. The bottleneck is that you don't want to break any processes in the process of doing it. So we emphasize starting small and being able to model and test prior to deployment. As I kind of belabored in this presentation, it's one of the best practices.
Also, want to remind the audience, if you have additional questions, please make sure you ask them, because we will be asking them of Katie live here. The second is, can I use existing investments for this to save money?
Sure, that's a very attractive option. And a lot of times, different folks in your IT teams are already heavily invested with their hypervisor provider or their network provider for routers and switches. So it sounds like an easy win, right? What we kind of went over in this presentation is that traditional hypervisor or hardware-based solutions don't give you the full visibility because they can't give you visibility outside your network, and they're not really dynamic to travel with the workload. It also takes a lot of effort to re-architect your network in order to be able to support it. But beyond that, manual methods for microsegmentation often fail. Using the firewalls, VLANs, and zones in the cloud just doesn't scale. It really has to be automated, and you need to design it for elasticity.
Okay. And how could this scale to the cloud?
That's a great question. Microsegmentation is actually the answer to the cloud, depending on the solution you choose. Cloud migration is a huge driver of microsegmentation. I think IDC had a poll out a while back that said from 2018 to 2020, if today about half, I think under half of enterprise IT environments in 2018 were in the cloud, and just over the course of 2 years, that's expected to grow to more than 2/3. So cloud migration is a huge driver, because how do you secure that? And because enterprises are embracing multi-cloud to avoid vendor lock-in, there's a lot to manage consistently. It's a challenge. So the answer is to centralize your security and leverage a host-based approach. And that way you can apply a policy consistently no matter where or what it's running on.
What are the main design principles for segmenting network as a service solutions?
Oh, that's a fantastic question. It's not really within the scope of what I'm talking about on the webinar today, so I'd probably have to phone a friend on that one. I regret to inform.
Okay. No worries. I wasn't sure if it would be something that we could do or not. And it looks like that's our questions. Katie, thank you so much for this great presentation. I'm going to close our poll question now and see what we have as far as responses go, if you're interested. Not too much of a surprise. Some have no adoption plans. Lots of people are here to educate themselves. 10% are pursuing active projects, and 2% have already adopted microsegmentation in their organization. So this is pretty much in line with other results we've seen around microsegmentation. And we have one final order of business. We want to make sure that if you would like to learn more about Illumio, you schedule a test drive by going to illumio.com/TV. And I'm sure that the Illumio folks would be very happy for you to take a look at the solution. It's a great solution on the market. I'll make sure no other questions have come in. No. And our final order of business is to give away a Tango gift card. Give me a second here while I look this up. And our winner today is Amanda Callis. Armando Callis. We'll be reaching out to you after the event, and you'll be getting an email from Melina at actualtechmedia.com. So please make sure if you see that, you know that it's not junk. Again, Katie and the folks at Illumio, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thanks so much, Scott. It's been a pleasure.
Everybody have a great day.